Hey everyone, welcome to the Discovering Goodness in the World series. I'm psyched to be here with you. My name is Lodra Rinsler. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a longtime meditation practitioner. I've been practicing meditation since I was about 6 years old and started doing retreats and things like that when I was in my preteens and teens. My first month-long retreat when I was 17 years old, and then continued to do longer and longer retreats and trainings and deepening of my own practice. And that, of course, at this point was 20 years ago that I started teaching now. So I've sort of seen it all a little bit in terms of working with some of the topics that we'll be covering in our class today. Namely, 20 years worth of talking to people about their anxiety, the stories that they carry around with themselves in their heads that actually keep them separated from themselves, separated from others, separated from the world around us. So we're going to be doing a lot of that work here. And I'll start by just even posing a simple question for you. If I gave you a choice, you could either live a life that is happy or a life that is stressed out. Which would you choose? Okay. I'm going to assume, since you're not physically in front of me, that you chose happy because thus far, that's got a 100% success rate, that answer. So no one's choosing. I'm going to just choose stress over happiness. And yet, so many of us spend our life making the opposite choice. So this class is about us making better choices with our own mind. And sometimes we don't think that this is a choice. We say, no, you don't understand that my life is just incredibly stressful because of my jobs, my kids, my work situation, my family situation, I just named the same things twice, but they're all doubly stressful. Your house, your friends, any number of things are coming up for you, I'm sure. Let's not even, forget about, of course, global situations, the pandemic, systemic racism, all sorts of things that are just in the air that are causing us stress. Yes, I want to acknowledge those. And say how much time we spend lost in our own heads, worrying about it, playing out imaginary scenarios that actually don't come to fruition. That is the choice that we can make. So the idea here is that we can make better choices with our minds so that we can continue to choose happiness instead of wallowing in some of the stress and anxiety that comes up. Let me clarify two terms here because I think they're important. Stress versus anxiety. Stress is just something that happens. I'm very sorry. I wish I could some people might even just turn off the video at this point, be like, I'm done here. I thought he was just going to tell me how to eliminate all stress in my life. I wish that I could be like, hey, push this little node in the back of your neck, and now you don't have to deal with money issues. You don't have to deal with that annoying in-law. You don't have to deal whatever it is. So it's not like that. Those situations arise. We know that, right? Yet, how much time we spend relating to stress versus how much time we spend relating to what's actually happening in the present moment is this choice that I'm trying to point out here. So let's do an example. Your accountant calls, I'm just thinking the tax situation because that's the one I mentioned, and they say, hey, you owe a lot of money. And you said, I didn't plan to spend all this money. I had no idea. The accountant doesn't turn to you and say, I need you to be incredibly held in a state of pain between now and whenever you figure out how to pay this. No one has ever told us that. The landlord doesn't say that to us when rent is due. Our boss doesn't say, hey, I need you to be completely stressed out between now and whenever this project's due. No one ever tells us that. And yet, what do we do in that moment? We start telling ourselves stories. Well, what if it goes like this? What if I never make any more money? What if I, did this and that? And then we start planning. Because the brain, for the record, just evolutionarily, is a problem-solving device. That's what it does. It's just wired to say, okay, there's something causing me stress. I've got to figure it out. And yet, for anyone who's ever had to look forward to what may be a stressful conversation, you know that there's no planning for it. I love this one, actually. Oh my gosh, so-and-so says they want to talk to me on Friday. And we play out every possible scenario of what they want to talk about, how if they bring up X, Y, and Z, what we're going to say, how we're going to defend ourselves, how they're wrong and we're right. And we don't even know what they want to talk about. And we get down into the meeting and we sit down with them and they say, I just wanted to catch up with you because we haven't talked in forever. And you say, oh my gosh, all those hours I spent in those stories is for naught. One of my favorite quotes in this regard is from the Tibetan teacher Dogo Kensei Rinpoche. He's a very wonderful Buddhist teacher, and he said, when he came to the West, he said, "Yeah, I don't understand why you all worry so much. You spend so much time worrying. Because if you worry about something and it doesn't happen, you just spend all that time wasted. And if you worry about something and it does happen, what was the point about worrying? It happened anyway." And I always think about that because we spend so much time telling ourselves stories in our own mind. And this, to come back to what I was going to refer to before, is what we would call anxiety. This is like us keeping ourselves locked in a state of stress by telling ourselves stories. And stressful things happen. Okay, the accountant says that, the in-law says this. We feel a physiological response of stress in the body. That is not your imagination. Please don't get me wrong. But how much time do you then hold yourself in that saying, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? That's anxiety. So coming back to this choice we made, how do we choose to be happy? How do we choose not to buy into stress? We actually have to train the mind to acknowledge when we're telling ourselves those stories and come back into the present moment. That's all we're doing in meditation. Well, that's the primary thing we're doing in meditation. We'll talk about some of the sort of subtle effects and benefits of meditation as well. But the primary thing is we acknowledge the story and then we come back to the present moment. In the practice that we'll be doing and focusing on is the idea of coming back to the breath as an object of our attention. Why would we come back to the breath? That's a boring object. Yet the entire time that you've been sitting here listening to me, you've also been breathing, right? It's not something that you have to think about. It's already happening. It's not something you have to generate. Sometimes people say, oh, I want to generate sounds. I want to do something with my body. That's fine and good if that's a tradition that you connect to. But in this particular tradition, coming out of the Buddhist realm, all we're doing is just being mindful, I'll define that as well, of the body breathing. Just being with the natural sensation of the in-breath and out-breath as it flows through us. Because it's already happening. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to fix anything about it. We don't have to change anything. There's so many parts of our life. When we wake up, maybe your kids jump on you, maybe there's a work email, you say, oh my gosh, I already need to fix, change, respond to something. There's nothing to respond to here. It's resting. We're resting with something that's already happening. So I used the term mindful a moment ago. I should define all of my terms in our first class. Mindfulness is the act of being present to what's currently occurring without judgment. So let's break that out. When we do mindfulness meditation, we are being with the body breathing, noticing the in-breath and out-breath, and it's just naturally occurring, and we're not judging ourselves. We don't judge ourselves and say, should it be deeper? Should it be shallower? We don't judge ourselves when the mind wanders off, and it will, I promise you. We just say, oh, that's the natural thing that the mind does. It's a problem-solving device. Okay, I acknowledge it. I come back. So this is what we do over and over again. We're just training the mind to become more mindful, to become more present. Now, that means that when we go into the rest of our day, I just looked in case there was going to be a mug of coffee here. There isn't, which is disappointing. But if there was a mug of coffee here to help wake me up this morning, then I would ideally take a sip and be present for it. Because I've been training my mind to be present with the breath. Then I'm more able to taste the morning coffee and just enjoy it instead of thinking through what has to happen in the day, right? When I'm with a loved one and they're going through a hard time, I'm present for them. I'm mindful. I'm there with what they are saying, what's presently occurring, without judgment. I'm not leaping in and saying, oh, I can solve this for you. I'm just there, which is such an act of compassion. So the good, the bad, the ugly of our life, we learn to be more present for it. This thing of anxiety that so many of us grapple with, the book that accompanies this course, Take Back Your Mind, Buddhist Advice for Anxious Times, it was written because I noticed just how many people were struggling with anxiety. As I said, I've taught meditation for 20 years now. And I've practiced it for 30 some odd. But it's like the last few years have just been really stressful for so many of us. There's been added stress. And as a result, anxiety, the stories we tell ourselves on top of the stress, has gone through the roof. So if you're in this class, I imagine this is something you grapple with, and it's not just you. That's the other thing. When I so many of the books I read, I'm like, why isn't anyone talking openly about this? I got to start a conversation about it. And this class is the continuation of that conversation. If so many of us are struggling with these issues around anxiety, why aren't we having conversation? Why aren't we learning to do something about it? There's a particularly potent moment that I actually read about in that book when I was out with loved ones, and this is pre-pandemic. We were having a dinner, and I guess it was 2019, yeah, maybe. And the topic of politics came up, and one of the people there just shut down automatically. They just stonewall. And I noticed it, and I didn't want to say anything and make them embarrassed. So I waited until we were settling up the bill, putting on our coats, and I turned to him and I said, "What's going on? Are you okay?" He said, I'm so anxious. I'm held in such a state of stress these days. It takes a half hour of just watching animal videos on the internet every day to come back to some semblance of normal. And I didn't even know this about my loved one. I was shocked. I said, if this person who I know is going through it, there must be so many other people who are as well. And I also thought, half hour of animal videos, there's a lot worse ways that many people cope with the anxiety. We drink, we pop a pill, we do all sorts of things that may not be as joyful as watching animal videos, and they might actually be harmful to us. So if we're all sort of on our own trying to grapple with this, can we actually come together and learn tools? And that tool in this case really is meditation, because meditation can help. So this is the good news. The good news is that meditation can help us acknowledge our anxious thoughts, see them as sort of the ephemeral gnats that they are, and let them go. Now, here's even better news. Okay. The better news is you're not an inherently anxious person, that you can, in fact, relax. Many of us identify and say, I'm an anxious person. This is just who I am. That's not true. You learned those behaviors. Maybe you learned them through family, through caregivers, through school, any number of things. But at a certain point, you sort of, in order to succeed, to be productive, whatever, then I've always got to be planning. I've always got to be anxious. That's not true. That's not who you are. You look at a young child. Maybe you're a parent, a godparent, or uncle, an aunt, something like that. And you could say, when I look at this young child, are they inherently anxious? No. They're joyful. So they must at some point learn these tendencies, make them habitual, and then continue to enact them in order to become anxious adults, right? So if we're not inherently anxious, who are we? Coming out of the Buddhist tradition, but it seems silly to even say that. It's just coming out of my own experience, coming out of the experience of everyone I've worked with in the last 20 years. It's the idea that when we relax and let go of some of these thoughts and these habitual patterns around anxiety, we find that we are inherently peaceful. What do we discover in meditation when we relax and let go of those thoughts? We discover what we would actually call in many traditions our basic goodness. This is the big point for our class here, our basic goodness. This is where we'll live for this class. So let me break out what this term means. Basic isn't like, these days we have things like, that person's a basic bitch, excuse my language, but, it's that sense, it's not like sort of like a negative thing. Basic is actually just fundamental to who we are. That's the idea. It's inherent, it's primordial. These are all good words for it. Innate, inherent. Yeah, I said that. Okay, good. So it's just the essence of, we could say, who we are. The essence of who we are is goodness. And it's not good versus bad, light versus dark, none of those sorts of things that you would see in Star Wars. It's a sense of wholeness, peace, completeness. So goodness, I often think of it as like basic okayness, because when we're meditating, we don't just get familiar with those anxiety-producing stories or our neurosis or jealousy or fear, whatever. We discover our innate wisdom, this basic goodness. So it's this sanity and wholeness right beneath the surface, our own vulnerable and tender core, waiting to emerge so we can actually be a benefit to ourselves and others. There's something really interesting that happens in meditation where we acknowledge that we've drifted off, we come back to the breath, and maybe there's a moment or 3 moments, a couple breaths, and we're just resting. We're just resting in our natural state, and that feels basically okay. In that moment, we're not like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? We're just okay. We feel okay. We feel whole. And that's what I'm talking about, which is why I say this isn't particularly a Buddhist thing. This is something that we can just experience in our own meditation practice. We can do it this week, which is my, this could be one of those points where I'm like, you gotta practice. I, put on a nice sweater for you, and I can be as entertaining as possible. But this, these talks alone aren't going to actually make a big change in your life. I'm just here to offer the encouragement, and as a community, we're all going to be practicing together. So there's some sense of a community accountability. So that what we're doing here is actually digging in and working with our own minds, but we're working with our own minds together. There are several hundred people doing this course from around the world. So wherever you are, whatever your time you're meditating, there's probably someone meditating at the same time. You can even sort of like mentally, like, aha, my radar goes off. There's someone meditating out there with me right now in this program. And then we sort of feel like, okay, I'm doing this. I'm not alone here. I'm not alone working with my mind. I'm not alone working with my anxiety. I can do this. We all have your back. So I want to return to that moment when we actually relax fully and we experience a sense of basic goodness. It's not just me and not just you that has it. Everyone possesses basic goodness. And the more we're able to relax into the present moment, the more we're able to discover it for ourselves. And by the way, if you breathed a sigh of relief when I started talking about this basic goodness stuff, you're not alone. The notion of basic goodness is powerful, and it's also very countercultural. We're taught from a young age that maybe, there's something sort of off or wrong with you. You want to do this, but no, that's not going to be a good career. You should do something else. From a young age, we're said, oh, this way of being is better than that way of being. And again, it's not any individual's fault, but societally, we're taught you should always want more. Society's like this little voice whispering in our ear going, well, you should probably get a better job, a better education, a better spouse, a better ... And then you'll be happy. But for anyone who's gotten that job, spouse, etc., you say either, now I want a different one, or you say, now I want something else. Because that's just sort of how we've been acculturated, that there's always something more that we should do, gain, and then we get to be happy. And yet it doesn't seem to be working out for anyone, so it's actually quite exhausting. If we're always trying to accomplish something new, always trying to gain something new, then we're never going to be happy. So much of this meditation thing is relaxing enough that we can actually come into the sense of wholeness and find and experience contentment in this moment. To just relax and be with who we actually are. To experience basic goodness for ourselves. It can be, I was going to use the term enlightening, but I think enlightenment sometimes has like very far out spiritual connotations for many of us. Relieving is probably a better term. A sense of just absolute relief that I don't always have to do more. I don't always have to produce more in order to be considered a success, in order to be considered worthy. When we rest in basic goodness, we feel an inherent sense of worthiness, an inherent sense of calm and peace that's just waiting to be discovered. So earlier I talked about this choice, happiness versus stress, anxiety. This is how we make that choice. We acknowledge the thoughts, we come back to the present moment. More thoughts arise, that's what the mind does, remember? We come back to the present moment. And we just keep doing this over and over again, training the mind that it doesn't have to chase after every anxiety-producing thought that comes up, that it can rest in this sense of goodness. We have a term, meditation practice. This implies, of course, that we must be practicing for something. If I said, oh, we're going to practice the violin, you would say, oh, cool, I'm going to practice the violin, then at some point I perform it somewhere. Where are we, quote unquote, performing meditation? in the rest of our everyday life, every other waking hour. This is not like a fun hobby. Sometimes it feels a little bit like hard work. In fact, I'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment. But there's a sense here of training. I can train the mind in the same way that we would train, for example, the body. That we are constantly learning new ways of being. And the more we do that, the easier it becomes to actually access the sense of mindfulness, presence in our day to day life. So, all of those things I talked about, being with a difficult family member or family member who's going through difficulty, drinking our morning coffee, walking the dog, whatever it is, we start to say, oh, I can relax and be here for it because I've been training my mind to do exactly that. The training aspect, I just mentioned physical disciplines. It's like sometimes people think, oh, I should be able to meditate. And then within that 20 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it is, it should feel like I just got an hour-long massage. And I love a good massage, don't get me wrong, but this is not that. And there's a little bit of a re-education that we have to do here just around this idea, because meditation is not like a one and done deal, and it's not always going to feel good. And if it doesn't feel good in the way that a massage would, there's nothing wrong with you. If there is a lot going on in your life, yeah, your mind is going to be running at 100 miles an hour, and we can't expect it to be at zero. Maybe it goes from 100 miles an hour down to 60. That's still good. Maybe there's less going on in your life. Your mind's sort of proverbially running at 40 miles an hour, and you slow it down to 20, and you feel very peaceful. That's wonderful. But there's no, again, if we talk about this definition of mindfulness, we're being present to what's currently occurring without judgment. We're not judging ourselves saying, this is a good meditation, this is a bad meditation. It's just meditation. Any time that we spend getting to know ourselves is a good amount of time. And I mentioned this physical discipline before. So whether we picked up a new language, a new musical instrument, new physical discipline, martial arts or CrossFit or something like that, at first it feels very awkward. We don't know where to hold the fingers when we're playing the instrument. We don't know how to like pronounce basic words in the new language. We don't know how to lift that heavy weight in a way that doesn't injure ourselves. So it's like at first, it's just us figuring out the awkwardness of learning a new skill. And it was sort of like, there's some part of it's like, well, I should be able to do this, right? Because like I spend all the time with my mind anyway, but we don't use our mind in this way. In the same way that we talk all the time, but we don't necessarily speak that new language. We use our body all the time, but we don't use it in this particular way to lift this particular weight. So on and so forth. You understand the analogy here. So the idea is that if we picked up the musical instrument, the language, the physical discipline once every other week, it basically put us back to square one every time, right? Like we're like, how do I say that word again? How do I hold the instrument? If I picked it up every week, maybe it's not so much an issue, but if I picked it up every day, that's where progress really happens. That's where it gets really interesting, where we pick up immediately from where we were left off the previous day with the scales or the language or that particular movement. And same thing with working with our mind. The more we put into this, the more we get out of it. If you actually want to make a change, then we do need to commit to a regular practice. And that regular practice, to start, could be 4 to 5 days a week. That's fine. If you can do daily, that's better. Everyone has so much going on in their life. I want to just acknowledge that your life is very busy. I don't even know half of the things that are going on with you, and yet I just know that you're busy because I've seen a lot of people be very busy, and that's often, by the way, something that we really pride ourselves on. Back when I was living in New York City, I'd run into someone on the street and say, "How are you doing?" And with great pride say, "Oh, I'm really busy right now." Oh, okay, good. I'm glad things are going well for you. Like that's the sort of the code for, oh, you must be flourishing. You've got so much going on. But that's also how many of us burn out, is busy. What we're doing in meditation is essentially recharging the batteries and taking time away from busy and into simplicity. And that, whatever else is going on, I'm not going to negate the importance of all the things that you're doing, but it's going to give you a particular presence and energy to do those things. So it's like stepping away from the busyness for a moment, 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, allows us then to come back into those other areas with a fully charged battery. So a regular practice, whether it is 10 or 15 minutes a day, if you've been meditating before, maybe it's 20, as many days as possible. And again, for anyone who wants to be in an accountability group, we have accountability groups that you can sort of communicate with and hold each other responsible for your practice. That's very good. And otherwise, you can just know, oh, there's people in this class that are also um, practicing right alongside me. The more we actually start to glimpse this goodness within ourselves, the more we actually see that goodness in the world around us. We slow down enough to drop our anxious stories and appreciate that morning coffee, that walk with the dog, but also we experience that goodness inside of us long enough that we might then be more inclined to check out the people around us. We say, oh, that person, even if they're acting from a little bit of a confused state, yeah, maybe they too possess basic goodness. Maybe they too, um, from a young age, inherently felt that sense of wholeness and completeness as is. So our loved ones possess basic goodness, our neighbors who we don't even know, even the difficult people in our life are basically good. And we'll get into this topic in much more depth in the weeks ahead for sure. Catching a glimpse of your basic goodness is where this sort of like beautiful part of meditation begins. Having meditated for this many decades now, at the entirety of the path, as far as I can understand it, given my limited capabilities, is one, we have that moment that we discover our basic goodness, even just a glimpse of it. That moment of, I can just rest with the body breathing. That's it. That's the discovery. You do that this week, congratulations, you're already doing wonderful. Two, over the course of our life, we develop greater confidence and trust in that basic goodness. We develop more of a relationship to it day in and day out, so that we live more from that lens and less from the lens of stress and anxiety. And three, then we start to continuously see the world around us through that lens of basic goodness, not through the lens of poverty mentality or they have what I want or any of these. It's just like, oh, I can acknowledge the goodness of those around me. So that's the entire path in 3 steps. We'll talk more about this in the weeks ahead. Everyone possesses basic goodness. We start to look around and we say, it's not just me, it's not just my loved ones, it's the person who cut me off in traffic, it's my ex, it's my difficult boss. All of these beings possess basic goodness, and I will acknowledge that some of them at times will also act like a jerk. Both can be true. In the same way that each one of us have at times been in touch with a sense of feeling okay, and times when we felt threatened, and then as a result of feeling threatened, we acted out in ways that did not feel good to anyone concerned. We know that from our own relationship, we can start to acknowledge that in others. Not that these are basically bad people out there, but that they might be having a hard day, or they might be going through something that we don't know about. So we're more able to give people a break because we too have faltered and moved away from our own basic goodness. See, that's what's happening with them. So I mentioned all these different groups before. You and me, plus everyone we love, plus those difficult people I just mentioned, plus the large number of people that we don't even know. All of these things add up to one thing, which is a society. When we think of society, we often think of it as like something out there. It's not, it's us. It's us here in this class. It's the people who are making noise around you. It's the neighbors. It's everyone around you right now. You're all part of society. So when we think about how society is made up of all of those individuals who possess basic goodness, we open up to the really very real possibility that society itself is basically good. And it acts from, individuals act from times to time of basically confused states, totally. But it's made up of individuals who actually, in their core, are striving to experience peace and calm. But because they don't often know how to do it, they're spiraling into anxiety and acting out as a result. So we're turning the dial here and realizing more goodness in our society, starting with and deepening our relationship with our own goodness. All this, of course, starts with your own meditation practice. So I look forward to talking more about this with you very soon. And I look forward to hearing how your meditation practice develops.